Thank you, Nozomi. Hi, everyone. My name is Carolina. I'm based in Portugal. First of all, I would like to thank Nozomi for the invitation for being here. We are very happy. Um, yeah, what I've been doing is help coordinate and also look at the development of this digital inclusiveness, multidimensional digital inclusiveness index, which is what I'm about to present today. One of the reasons that we were also invited, as Nozomi kindly said, is that we talked in sustainable farming about the work that we are doing, and that is why we are here to showcase what we call the MDII, and also try to understand if open the discussion in terms of what is the usefulness and how this tool could help in the digital tools and innovations that are being developed right now. So I'm going to share my screen. Perfect. Okay, as I mentioned, we're here to discuss the Multidimensional Digital Inclusivity Index. And this essentially is a framework and also a tool that allows to evaluate how inclusive digital innovations are in agri-systems. So right now, the agenda for today is let's revise what is the starting point for the MDII. What is the problem that we have? And then we're going to look at what is the MDII, what is the ecosystem, how it's been developed, applied, and what is the framework. And lastly, we're going to highlight some findings of a use case, which is IRE, a smart irrigation app that has been deployed in Tunisia. So one of the things that we already know is digital inequality exists, right? And it is also true and visible that we have a lot of people that are unconnected, especially women, and especially in the areas of South Asia and Africa. So the problem here is, although technology is moving so fast, this rapid digitization also brings the risk of further increasing the digital divide. So while we want to make things more technological and closer to people, if we don't take into consideration what are their specific challenges, we can have unintended consequences and further open the digital divide and also gender gap. So with this in mind, we also know that part of the problem goes into this historically underrepresented groups. So the MDII started by looking at what are these groups? We identify women in agri systems, unlettered individuals, people with specific needs, youth, and rural communities. So in our research, we started to understand, okay, how can we have, what are the challenges or the main questions each of these underrepresented groups have, right? And based on that, we started to understand, okay, accounting for the needs for each underrepresented groups, what do we need to focus on to be able to evaluate the digital tool and understand if it is really inclusive to all. So the MDII appears as this ambitious scientific project, and it's very interesting because it's trying to combine traditional evaluation approaches with also with AI technologies. And the main goal here is to make digital inclusiveness the worldwide norm for more resilient food, water, and land systems. So we need to make sure that the tools, the innovations, the digital innovations that are being developed are accessible, ethical, and beneficial. So if we need to look in terms of outcome, what the MDII allows is to have an evidence-based improvements. One of the things that we know is that since technology is moving really fast, the improvements that need to be done, they need to be human-centered, right? But they also need to have evidence to support those improvements. That's why the MDII helps in terms of outcome to standardize data collection and also evaluation methods. Secondly, the second outcome we would like to have from the MDII is policy and strategy integration. So once we have the evidence-based improvements, how do they translate to be integrated in terms of strategy and policy? Sometimes what happens is that teams need to have recommendations so they can be integrated not only on the development, but also on the technical development, but also on policy and strategy. And thirdly, the third outcome would be scalable and context aware. So the MDII is being developed with this idea of being scalable. So it's modular, it's offline friendly, right? And it can also be scaled through AI technologies while keeping it context aware. And yes, it is a challenge to take care and look at all of these different perspectives. So in terms of the MDII, we already understand that it is a tool that aims to evaluate digital innovations, right? And the MDII started with being a small thing and has expanded to have this being also inclusive by nature by bringing different actors to the MDII itself. So when we're talking about MDII, it's not only about the theoretical framework, but also how can we scale and create an ecosystem. So on the right-hand side, we can see that we have IRI that is collaborating in terms of implementation. We have CIMIT that is contributing with data collection. We also have a gender platform, which are the main evaluators. I'll explain briefly what this means. We have Alliance helping on the human-centered design. IFPRI also applied a portion of the MDII in their Bright survey. We have FAO and WAPOR as a main supporter that enabled us to have access to a first set of pilot tools so we could apply the MDII. So in terms of ecosystem, it is really something that is big. And right now, the MDII has been implemented in 3 tools in Ethiopia, Tunisia, Ghana, India, Indonesia, Jordan, Malawi, Mozambique, and Pakistan. And when we were developing the MDII, and once again, as a challenging process to overcome, is how can we develop a tool that can be tool agnostic in terms of its evaluation, and also agnostic in terms of the stage of the development of the tool that we are evaluating. So that way we can say that the MDII can allow, we can do evaluations for farm advisory tools, government decision support tools, digital enabled sensors, and others. And it can also be applied in the deployed tools and in tools that are in development. So it's very flexible. So when we're talking about the MDII, not only the theoretical, but just looking at the macro tool of the MDII as a tool, what we aim to have is the MDII helping developers and teams answer, is this tool really inclusive for the users that it intends? And where are the gaps? I was telling Nozomi in the beginning, which is the MDII being an index is going to present a number, which is a score. But more than the score, what is important here is to find where are the gaps in that tool, either in terms of usability, trust, local alignment, in terms of process, ethical conformity, and things like that. Because real change and real improvement comes when we identify the gaps, when we measure them, and that gives us the ability to choose how we want to move forward and improve. So the MDII can be used to generate automated evidence-based recommendations. So this means that once we have a score for the evaluated tool, we can understand what are the best recommendations that apply for the iteration of that tool. We can also run evaluations with an offline friendly solution, because to collect data, for example, from end users or downstream beneficiaries, sometimes we also face internet limitations. So we are taking that into consideration in the development of the solution. We also can use the MDII to empower field teams with ready step-by-step guides and also scale evaluations. And that is where AI technologies and scalable pipelines come in. So in terms of process, how does this work? We have innovators or developers that can request an MDII evaluation. So this is an entry point, right? And this can take place at any point in the development process. Of course, if we're talking about tools that already have been deployed, there are more elements or more indicators that we can evaluate. Those that are still in the development stage, there are less indicators that we can look. However, it can be applied at any stage. Then the evaluators are going to collaborate with the innovators or developers to extract information. And with that information, then we go to essentially 3 types of users. We go to domain-specific experts, which they are kind of a third party in terms of assessment. So they look at the information that was provided by the innovators or developers and assess as independent but domain-specific experts. And then on the other end, we have end users or downstream beneficiaries, those that are impacted by the decisions made by the tool but are not users, and they also provide feedback around the tool. And with this information, this big data, we look and generate either scores, insights, and recommendations. This is visible in a dashboard, and also along with a report. So looking at the theoretical framework, the MDII is a big framework. That is true. We recognize that. So essentially, the indicators or the aspects that we are evaluating are focused in 3 main areas, what we call the mega groups, in terms of insights. One of the things that was important in the development of the MDII is that most of the times when digital tools are being evaluated, the evaluation is either too technical or focuses more on usability and usage effectiveness, but that is only one component of the tool, right? The tool is applied in a certain context with certain actors. So we need to extend how we look at the evaluation of tools and broaden in terms of social consequences. Is the tool actually producing the beneficial impacts it aims to produce? That is one thing. And also, every tool that is developed, although it might have good intent, sometimes there are unintended outcome and consequences from the usage of that tool. So looking at the risks and harms, so the social consequences, is also really important to understand if the tool that is being evaluated is truly inclusive and bringing people together instead of widening the digital divide. And also, not only we need to look at social consequences, we also need to understand how the innovation process, how the development of that tool is in terms of its inclusiveness. And when we talk about inclusiveness, this is a concept that aims to aggregate both the word inclusion and inclusivity. It's not only about creating the access or the opportunities for people to be included, but also how do they feel included in the process? It's not only having a place on the table, but also how Do they feel part of that process? So in that regard, we need to look at the stakeholder relationships. We need to understand if in the development of the tool, are we accounting for ethical or responsible innovation? Are there co-creation and governance processes in place? So the MDII aims to look at, yes, evidence-based aspect in terms of the tool, how it is created technically, how is the interaction between human and tool, but we cannot remove that from the entire ecosystem in the development of the tool. So this means that we have a multi-level analysis, and this is the interesting part of the MDII. We can look at what is the impact, or how is that tool performing, both at an individual level, right? What is the perception of inclusion from individuals? What is the impact on a community level, but also on a landscape level? And the analysis goes across all these different tiers. So looking at our use case that I mentioned in the beginning, one of the tools that we evaluated is eRay. So it's a smart irrigation app that gives advice to wheat growers in terms of real-time irrigation schedules. As I mentioned, this has been applied and deployed in Tunisia. And the goal, the function of the application is to provide the irrigation recommendations while using irrigation forecasts. So this allows, in terms of the tool, to insert what are the plots, understand what are the sowing dates, and understand what is the water level stress, and what is the need or not to irrigate that particular plot. So here on the left-hand side, you are seeing some screenshots of the interface of the tool. So once we apply the MDII, this is the first thing that we can take a look. So we can have an overall score, which is the combination of all the dimensions, right? So we understand that E-rate is approaching expectations. In the middle, then we can go a little bit more granular and understand, okay, so if it is 54 points or 54% out of 100, where are the things in which the tool is performing better and where the tool is having a lower performance? So from here, we can understand that there's a discrepancy or a variance in terms of score per dimension. We can see that it goes from 65% in beneficial impact to 40% on the supportive ecosystem dimension. So while this already gives us the first impression, in the sense that we understand that the tool is producing good outcomes and has a beneficial impact in field real context. However, there are weaknesses in local engagement, feedback, and governance. So essentially, what we can say from a macro view is that it is important. There are inclusiveness gaps related with the system. So we need to try to understand how can we translate this findings, which are more general, into specific recommendations for iteration. So looking at the array, and I'm not going to read all of this, we can also share the presentation. So all of the tools have strengths and weaknesses, right? In terms of the strengths, yes, array has strong problem relevance. There's no sensitive data collected. So in terms of risks and harms, there's a good foundation. There are good aspects in terms of accessibility, which is the Android compatibility and the efforts to improve user experience. And also, even if the dimensions score a little bit lower, there are always strengths in each dimension. So in terms of E-Ray, the institutional collaboration is really, really strong, and it is important. In terms of ethical and responsible innovation, there's the intention of transparency on data practices. And also in terms of co-creation in governments, the institutional collaboration is also very important. But now let's start looking not only to the forest, but more into detail. So when we're looking at the scores, this slide represents which indicators scored more than 75%. Remember that the MDII is really big. So it has 7 dimensions, 27 subdimensions, and 19 indicators. Looking at this, what can we see? So most of the indicators that performed higher than 75% are from beneficial impact. And that aligns with the first graph that we saw, right? So we can understand that in terms of economic sustainability, the tool scored really, really well. This means that it has in place a long-term plan to be, so it has in place a long-term plan to still be sustainable over time, right? The other thing we can see, it has high engagement in problem definition. It is relevant to the target groups and other indicators. We can also see that in terms of risks and harms, although it scored overall lower, it still have things that are very important. So in terms of unauthorized commercialization of data, this means that the information that the tool has, because it does not collect personal sensitive information, and the way that it has this security certificate, it makes less prone to create unintended impacts, unintended negative consequences. However, what can we also understand here? If you remember, I mentioned that we evaluate 7 dimensions. In this case, only 5 dimensions have indicators that are higher than 75%. So why is that? We need now to check, okay, since ethical and responsible innovation and accessibility indicators were left out of this first filter, what does this indicate? And this personally is the interesting part. So these are the indicators that scored less than 25%. Not that much, which is great. So it means that the majority of indicators are between 25 and 75%. And it's also interesting to see that the indicators that scored lower are related with risk and harms, ethical and responsible innovation, and co-creation and governance. So what does this mean? This means that there are specific elements, because this is at the very granular level, there are very specific indicators that could benefit from specific recommendations to increase scores. So what do we take here? Looking at the MDII, we can understand what is working really well in terms of strengths, but we can also identify, which is the most important thing, what are the areas for improvement. And all areas, all dimensions, as they have their strengths, they also have their weaknesses. So it is important in IRA's case, we understood that although the intention and although the tool is aligned with the problem definition and there's a problem solution fit, the outputs are not easily understood by less technical users. And why does this fall into beneficial impact? If the understanding of the outputs are not accessible, the beneficial impact of the tool decreases. So it decreases the potential of the tool in solving the problem it aims to solve. In terms of support ecosystem, while we understand that IRA has very strong institutional collaboration, it is still visible that in terms of support, either not only in terms of the interaction with the tool, but the training is really centralized. So it really needs to expand its community-driven supports. And also, in terms of what I would like to highlight is in co-creation and governance, we also understood that it was a co-development process here. However, users that helped design the tool also don't have clarity how do their contributions translated to updates or decisions? So coming towards the end, this is just a small snippet or example of what the MDII can produce. By looking at the lowest scores, by relating, by looking how scores relate with each other, we can understand that, for example, on E-Ray, the way that the outputs are communicated to the user are really important. And this is not only in terms of interpretation, which is printables, for example, but it also is about inclusive terminology. Maybe the tool needs to make graph interpretation clearer. It is based online. So we need to consider that when we have a tool that runs 100% online, it can also exclude those with more intermittent access. So offline access and data catching features should be important. In terms of going back to the graphs, as you've seen, probably while it looks very technical, it also in terms of digital accessibility can be improved in terms of visual accessibility for those that have conditions that require, for example, more contrasting colors in the user interface and whatnot. And also we can look at, okay, how can we expand the community support, or how can we expand the community base that is interacting with the tool? So for example, there can be user stories, or there can be within the app what's new cards that explain how the decisions that were or how the input that was provided to the development of the tool translated to specific decisions. So with this, what can we conclude and understand? That digital development or digital inclusiveness is not only technical. And this is the thing that becomes important to understand, that when we have teams that are working on a digital solution, a digital innovation, such as E-Ray, there are a lot of things that are outside of their sphere of control or their scope. So although the MDII looks and evaluates policies, ecosystems, it also takes into consideration that most of the times the developers or the development teams cannot apply that and cannot change policy, but they can make decisions that support those improvements. So once we have feedback loops, having data stewards for more ethical and responsible use of data, we can then increase user experience, trust and usage, and especially interpretation of the outputs. And with that, increase the broader and create more change, a systemic change in terms of responsiveness of institutions, digital inclusiveness itself, and also gender equity and social inclusion. So the MDII really helps to trace this path from design to impact and understand what is within this developer's scope and a sphere of control in creating active change. So tying back to the beginning, we are very interested in looking at use cases in which we can apply the MDII. So if you think you have a good use case that would make sense to evaluate its digital inclusiveness, you can reach out to us, to our team, and we can run those evaluations. What we require is access to the development team to collect information, and also support in identifying and implementing surveys for end users and downstream beneficiaries, if applicable. So in terms of range, the MDII is still in process. We have a proof of concept that is working. We're working on scaling right now. So tools, any type of tool that is digital can be evaluated. Ideally, a deployed tool is better because it has a more accessible user base. So if you think that you have a good use case, you can always reach out to us.